The storm struck Evergreen like a predator. Snow clawed at rooftops, swallowing fences, streets, and fields beneath an endless white. By nightfall, the town lay silenced, its shutters barred, families huddled close to fireplaces, praying the blizzard would pass. But for Officer Olivia Hayes, duty did not bend to weather. At 33, she had worn the badge for nearly a decade. Tall, broad-shouldered, auburn hair pinned beneath her cap. Life had carved her strength from hardship. A father lost in a mill accident. Years spent raising 2 younger brothers while her mother worked double shifts. People in Evergreen knew her as steady, dependable, the one who never faltered when storms, literal or human, swept through town. In the passenger seat, Max watched the road with unblinking vigilance. 6 years old, scar tracing his flank, the German Shepherd had once been cast aside by Denver's K9 unit. Too damaged, they said. But Olivia had seen something others overlooked, a spark in his amber eyes, a loyalty untamed by injury. She brought him home, believing his story wasn't over. That night, fate tested them both. A patch of black ice sent Olivia's cruiser sliding, metal shrieking as it folded beneath the weight of snow and steel. Trapped, her breath came shallow, fading like smoke. The storm howled, erasing her cries. No one should have found her, yet Max refused to surrender. His bark tore through the blizzard, raw and desperate, carrying farther than any siren. It was a 9-year-old girl alone, clutching her coat against the gale who heard him. Drawn by the sound, she stumbled upon the wreck, her small hands trembling as she brushed snow from shattered glass. In that moment, innocence met loyalty, and together they uncovered more than a heartbeat in twisted metal. Hidden beneath Olivia's crushed patrol car was a case file she was never meant to open, a file that held proof of corruption, winding through Evergreen's veins, reaching into places too powerful to confront in daylight. And here's the twist. When the girl tried to pull it free, headlights cut through the snow. A black SUV. Someone else had come for that file. Someone who wanted it buried forever. This was no simple rescue. It was the night courage collided with corruption, when a child, a wounded dog, and a fallen officer ignited a chain of events that would tear open the secrets of an entire town. Max had never left her side since. The storm rattled the cruiser as they crawled down County Road 14, one of the loneliest stretches outside town. Snowflakes slapped the windshield in wild, dizzying spirals. Olivia leaned forward, her gloved hands steady on the wheel. "Almost done, boy," she said, softly, as though reassuring them both. Her voice carried a tone practiced through years of calming, frightened neighbors, stray children, and even herself. She reached over and brushed Max's fur. He leaned slightly into her hand, his warmth grounding her against the bitter cold pressing through the windows. Max's ears twitched, his body stiffened. A low rumble formed in his chest. "What is it?" Olivia asked, her eyes narrowing as she peered through the storm. And then she saw them. Headlights, too close, too sudden. A pair of glaring beams cut through the blizzard from behind, burning against the snow. No one should have been on this road tonight. The county had issued a travel ban. Her pulse quickened. The lights surged forward. An engine roared. "Damn it," Olivia muttered, jerking the wheel slightly as the black shape of a truck bore down on them. The impact came, like a hammer. Metal screamed as the truck slammed into the rear of her cruiser, shoving it forward across the slick road. Olivia gritted her teeth, fighting the wheel, her body straining against the seatbelt. Max barked, furiously, claws scrabbling against the floor. The truck did not back off. It pressed harder. Olivia's instinct screamed. This wasn't random. Whoever was behind her wanted her gone. The cruiser skidded sideways. The guardrail loomed. And then, with a final brutal shove, the patrol car smashed through it. Gravity yanked them down the embankment, the world flipping end over. And glass shattered. Snow exploded inward. The sound of steel collapsing drowned out everything else. When at last the car stopped, it lay on its side at the bottom of the slope, half buried in snow. The front end was crumpled, the roof bent, steam hissing from the ruptured hood. Inside, Olivia hung, suspended from her seatbelt. Blood streamed from a gash above her temple, staining her pale skin crimson. Her lips moved faintly, breath shallow before her eyes rolled back. The world dimmed into silence. Max had been thrown hard across the cabin, slamming into the opposite door. He shook himself, ears ringing, body aching. For a moment, he staggered, then forced his legs beneath him. His heart raced, nostrils flaring. He turned toward Olivia, whining, barking, pawing at her limp form. He lunged at the seatbelt, tugging desperately with his teeth. The strap would not budge. He pawed at the buckle, whining louder, then braced his body and pulled again. Nothing. He barked sharply, the sound echoing against the twisted interior. Olivia didn't stir. Max's instinct screamed at him to stay, to keep guarding her. But another part of him, the training drilled into his bones, told him what he had to do. If he couldn't free her, he had to find help. He glanced once more at Olivia's face, pale and motionless, his ears flattened. Then he turned, scrambling toward the shattered window. Snowflakes rushed in, biting at his fur. With one final heave, he launched himself out into the blizzard. The world outside was savage. Wind howled across the trees, and snow blinded the ground. Max's paws sank, deep. But he pressed forward, nose lifted, breath steaming into the night. Each stride sent powder spraying. He barked once, twice. The sound lost almost instantly to the storm. Still, he ran. Behind him, the ruined cruiser creaked and groaned under its own weight. Inside, Olivia's chest rose in shallow, fragile gasps, her badge glinting faintly in the dim moonlight through the broken glass. Above, the black truck lingered briefly at the top of the hill, headlights dim now before disappearing back into the storm. Max didn't look back. He ran as though the life of his partner, and perhaps something more, depended on it. A silhouette blurred into the curtain of white, a lone shadow fighting against nature and against the evil that had set this night into motion. The storm devoured the sound of his paws. Yet somewhere, not far ahead, fate was already preparing the answer to his call. Emily Parker hated walking home in the dark, but sometimes her grandmother lost track of time when telling stories. Tonight had been one of those nights. Her grandmother, Ruth Parker, was a small woman with silver hair that framed her wrinkled face like a halo. She had lived in Evergreen her whole life and still wore the same knitted shawl she had owned since the 1,970 seconds. Ruth's house smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, a place Emily adored. But when the clock chimed past 9 and the blizzard outside grew heavier, Ruth insisted her granddaughter hurry home before the storm worsened. So now, Emily trudged down the snow-packed lane, her pink wool coat buttoned to her chin, a bright red knit hat drooping over one ear. At 9 years old, she was a slight child, thin, with pale cheeks that always reeked in the cold. Her long blonde hair had been woven into a single braid by her grandmother's careful fingers. Emily's eyes were wide and blue, a mirror of the Colorado sky she loved in summer, though tonight they darted nervously at every shifting shadow. She clutched a small backpack against her chest. Inside it, a notebook filled with drawings of horses and dogs, animals she dreamed of having, but never did. Her parents both worked double shifts at a motel in town, often too tired to give Emily more than quick hugs before collapsing into bed. It was Ruth who gave Emily her stories, her warmth, her sense that even in small people could live large adventures. But the storm was turning her excitement into dread. The snow came down in thick sheets, stinging her cheeks, blinding her path. The road back to her family's little rented house seemed endless. Emily's boots sank deep, each step slower than the last. She tried humming one of her grandmother's old hymns, but the wind carried the sound away. That was when she heard it, a bark. It cut through the storm, loud, urgent, and close. Emily froze, heart pounding. The bark came again, sharper this time, as if commanding attention. She squinted into the swirling white. A shape emerged, bounding toward her through the drifts. Her first instinct was fear. Coyotes sometimes prowled the outskirts of Evergreen, and though Ruth always assured her they kept to themselves, the idea of one rushing at her now made Emily's breath catch. She stumbled back a step, clutching her backpack tighter. But as the shape neared, it resolved into something familiar. A large dog, fur black and tan, ears erect against the snow. Its chest was broad, its muscles powerful, yet its eyes golden, amber shone, not with menace, but with fierce urgency. The German Shepherd slowed just enough not to crash into fur. Snow clung to its fur, and a shallow scar along its side gleamed in the faint light from a distant street lamp. The dog barked again, then circled her, brushing against her coat before darting a few feet ahead and glancing back. Emily blinked, trembling. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the storm. The dog trotted back, pressing its cold nose against her mitten, then tugged lightly at her sleeve. Emily gasped, pulling back, but the dog didn't bare its teeth or growl. Instead, it wet eyes wide, then tugged again more insistently. It wants me to follow, she realized. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Sometimes, Emily, God sends help in unexpected ways. When you feel fear, look closer. You might find it's really a call for courage. Emily's breath fogged in front of her face as she hesitated. This was crazy. She should keep going home. But something in the dog's desperation made her chest ache. She had seen stray animals before, thin and cautious. But this dog was different. It was strong, trained. Its every movement said it had a purpose. She crouched slightly, her braid slipping over her shoulder. "Okay, boy," she whispered, her voice quivering. "Show me." The German shepherd barked once, sharp with approval, then spun and bounded forward. After a few yards, it stopped and looked back, waiting. Emily glanced behind her. The road home looked lonelier than ever. Ahead, the dog's tracks cut a path into the storm. Her fingers tightened on her backpack straps. And then she stepped after him. The dog Max quickened his pace once she followed, occasionally running ahead before circling back, barking encouragement. Emily's boots sank, deeper, but she forced herself forward, the dog's presence pulling her along like an invisible rope. Every so often, Max would stop, plant himself firmly, and bark into the wind, as if to say, "Hurry." Emily stumbled, fell once into the drifts, snow soaking through her mittens. Tears stung her eyes, but when she looked up, Max was there, pressing his head against her shoulder, steadying her. She laughed shakily despite the fear. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she murmured. Max barked again, almost as if in answer, before bounding off. Step by step, Emily followed, her breath ragged but determined. The storm still and howled, but something inside her shifted. She wasn't alone anymore, and she had no idea that by following this dog into the blizzard, she had stepped into a story much larger than herself, a story that would change not only her life, but the life of the woman lying broken in the snow ahead. The storm seemed endless, wrapping the world in a white shroud. Emily's small boots crunched after Max's heavier paws as he led her down a slope hidden behind snow-laden pines. The air was sharp in her lungs, burning with every breath, but she pressed on. She had promised herself without even speaking that if the dog wanted her to come, she would not abandon him. Suddenly, Max halted. His body went rigid, ears pricking forward, a low whine rising from his throat. Emily stumbled to a stop beside him, brushing snow from her lashes. That was when she saw it. Through the blowing snow, a shape emerged like some ghostly carcass. The patrol car lay on its side, at the bottom of the ravine, its steel body twisted and mangled. The hood steamed faintly, and the shattered windshield reflected the moonlight in jagged shards. Red and blue lights flickered weakly from the roof, broken, sputtering, as though even the car itself was fighting to breathe. Emily's stomach knotted. She had never seen a real wreck before, only on television when the news showed accidents on the interstate. But this was terrifying. She clutched her backpack straps, frozen for a moment. Max barked sharply, snapping her from her trance. He bounded down the slope toward the wreck, snow spraying behind him. Emily followed carefully, sliding, falling, once to her knees, then scrambling upright. Her braid had loosened, strands of blonde hair sticking to her flushed cheeks. Fear made her legs weak, but her curiosity and sense of responsibility tugged her forward. They reached the crumpled cruiser. Max circled it, sniffing frantically, his paws scraped at the twisted door, claws ringing against the metal. He barked deep and urgent, his breath puffing clouds in the cold. Emily crept closer, peering through a jagged crack in the window. Her heart thumped painfully against her ribs. Inside, a woman hung suspended by a seatbelt, her auburn hair loose and matted with blood. Her uniform jacket was torn, the badge glinting faintly. Her skin looked as pale as the snow itself, lips cracked and bluish. Emily gasped. "She's alive." The officer's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Emily pressed her mittened hand to the glass, her breath fogging it. I didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't just leave. Max shoved at the rear door, whining. Emily tried the handle, pulling with all her small strength, but it barely budged. She pressed her cheek to the gap and saw that the frame was bent. Still, there was a narrow space. Her small size, the very thing she often hated when trying to reach kitchen cupboards or play basketball at school, was now her only advantage. Her mitten slipped off as she pressed her bare fingers against the cold metal. She squeezed her slim body sideways, inching through the jagged opening. The door frame scraped her coat, tearing a small hole near the hem, but she pushed until she tumbled inside, landing awkwardly on the roof that now served as the car's floor. The air inside smelled of gasoline and iron. Emily gagged slightly, but steadied herself. She looked up at the officer. The woman's head lolled weakly, a thin line of blood running down her temple. Max barked encouragement from outside, his muzzle pushing through the gap. "I'm here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll help." She reached up, her small hands fumbling with the seatbelt buckle. Her fingers were cold, stiff, slipping against the metal. She thought of her grandmother's words about courage, and she pressed harder. With a sudden click, the buckle released. The woman slumped forward. Emily gasped, struggling to brace her. She wasn't strong enough to hold much weight, but somehow, maybe with adrenaline, maybe with sheer will, she guided the officer's body down carefully onto the tilted seat. The officer groaned faintly, her eyelids fluttering. Emily brushed snowflakes from the woman's cheek where they had blown in. "It's okay, we're getting you out," Max barked, again, louder this time, paws scraping furiously at the metal as though urging her to hurry. Emily tugged at the woman's arm, inching her toward the opening. It was hard work. Her small boots slipped on the slanted surface. Her arms AKD. She whispered encouragement the way she had heard her grandmother whisper when lifting. Something heavy. One more. Just one more. Bit by bit, she pulled. Max shoved his head through the gap, teeth grabbing at the officer's sleeve, not roughly, but firmly helping guide her out. Between girl and dog, they managed to drag her limp body through the opening and into the snow. Emily tumbled out, behind, collapsing on her knees, gasping for air. The cold bit into her palms, but she barely noticed. She looked at the officer lying in the snow, chest still rising faintly. Relief flooded. "Par her. We did it," she whispered to Max, tears springing to her eyes. "We got her. Out." Max stood over the woman protectively, his ears back, his amber eyes sharp and watchful. He licked her cheek once, then glanced toward the woods, body tense again. Emily followed his gaze. That was when she saw them. On the slope above, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, there were tire tracks cutting across the untouched snow. Wide, heavy tracks, too fresh to be from plows or old farm trucks. They led straight to the guardrail, where the cruiser had smashed through. Emily's breath caught. Her grandmother had taught her how to read the snow for rabbit tracks and deer paths. These tracks told a different story. The patrol car hadn't just slipped. Something else had been here. Something big. Her blue eyes widened, fear prickling her spine. She looked at Max, whose low growl vibrated through the night. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the storm. The snow swirled harder around them, as if to swallow her words. The snow had thickened, falling in furious spirals that erased footprints almost as soon as they were made. Emily stood, trembling beside the unconscious officer, her small frame dwarfed by the storm. Her breath came in quick bursts, fogging into the night. She had never carried anything heavier than school books or grocery bags, yet now she faced the impossible, helping a grown woman survive. Olivia Hayes, pale and still, lay in the snow where Emily and Max had dragged her. Her auburn hair clung damp to her forehead, blood drying against her temple. Even in this state, Olivia looked formidable, broad-shouldered, the kind of woman who commanded respect just by standing. But now she seemed fragile, broken, and unbearably human. Emily knelt, brushing snow from the officer's coat. "We need to move you," she whispered. Though Olivia couldn't hear, her blue eyes filled with worry, but she forced herself to breathe. Max wed low in his throat, pacing in tight circles. His amber eyes darted to the ridge above, ears prick-ricked. His powerful body, scar visible along his flank, trembled, not with cold, but with awareness. He growled suddenly, deep and guttural, staring toward the road. Emily froze. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance, faint yet deliberate, cutting through the white curtain of the storm. A black vehicle, the same kind of shape that might have rammed Olivia's car. Her heart lurched. The realization settled in, like ice in, her chest. Whoever caused the crash might be coming back to finish the job. Max barked sharply, his voice slicing. The night. He positioned himself between the car and the approaching lights, his hackles raised. His stance screamed, "Warning." Yet his quick glance back at Emily was clear. Go now. Emily scrambled to her feet, her mittens damp and torn. She tugged at Olivia's arm, straining with all her 9-year-old strength. The woman was heavy, far too heavy for her alone. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to give up. "Help me, Max," she pleaded. The German shepherd stepped in, clamping his teeth gently into Olivia's sleeve. Together, dog and child heaved, dragging the unconscious officer inch by inch away from the wreck. Snow squeaked under their weight, Olivia's boots carving faint trails behind. The headlights grew brighter. Emily dared to glance back and saw the dark outline of the vehicle crawling closer, slow and deliberate, as though searching. Panic surged. "Come on, Max. Faster," she whispered desperately. Max growled agreement, pulling harder. His muscles rippled beneath his thick coat, his breath steaming with effort. Emily pushed from behind, her boots slipping in the eld. Drifts. Each step felt like a lifetime. At the edge of the ravine, Max veered sharply left toward a narrow trail, hidden among fir trees. Emily followed, gasping as branches clawed at her coat. The path was uneven, choked with snow, but it offered cover. The headlights faded behind them, blocked by the trees. The forest swallowed them in shadows. Emily's braid clung damp against her back, her cheeks raw from windburn, her small arms ADHD, but she clung to Olivia's coat with stubborn determination. They trudged deeper, the storm muffling all sound except their ragged breaths. Max led with uncanny precision, stopping often to glance back at Emily and Olivia. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, sharp with focus. He was more than a dog now. He was their guide, their guardian, their compass through the dark. Emily's mind raced with questions she was too afraid to speak. Why would anyone want to hurt a police officer? Why crash into her car on a night like this? She was only 9, yet she felt the crushing weight of something bigger, darker, pressing in. Behind them, faint and distant, came the low growl of an engine. Emily's blood ran cold. The black vehicle was still out there, circling like a predator, unwilling to give up its prey. Her small hand tightened on Olivia's sleeve. "We have to keep going," she whispered, mostly to herself. The trees grew denser, their trunks black pillars against the snow. Emily stumbled over roots, buried under drifts, falling hard on her knees. Pain and shot up her legs, but she bit back a cry. Max immediately doubled back, nudging her shoulder with his cold nose, urging her up. His eyes said what she could not. "Don't stop." Emily forced herself up, her breath shuddering. She pulled Olivia's arm again, moving forward step by agonizing step. Her body screamed for rest, but fear drove her. The sense of being hunted gnawed at her spine, each gust of wind sounding like approaching footsteps. At last, the trail dipped into a hollow where the snow lay deeper. Max barked once, soft, but insistent, and pushed Olivia's weight further onto Emily's side. They collapsed briefly against a fallen log. Olivia slumped between them. Emily brushed frost from her lashes, staring at the officer's still face. "Please, wake up," she whispered, voice cracking. "Please!" But Olivia remained silent, her chest rising faintly. Above the howl of the storm, the sound came again, the faint crunch of tires somewhere not far. Emily's heart thudded painfully. She clung to Max's fur with one mittened hand, the other still gripping Olivia's arm. Max bared his teeth, a low growl, vibrating in his chest. His ears flicked toward the sound, and his entire body coiled like a spring. He was ready to defend them if the shadows closed in. Emily pressed her forehead against the dog's shoulder for a moment, taking strength from his steady presence. She was terrified, but she wasn't alone. They rose together once more, slipping deeper into the forest, leaving behind the broken cruiser and the headlights that searched for them. The blizzard pressed in on every side, relentless, merciless. But within that storm, a 9-year-old girl, a wounded officer, and a scarred German shepherd fought forward as one. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing the same truth. They were being hunted. The storm had become a living thing, its roar filling the forest like the voice of an angry god. Emily's legs ached, her small arms trembling from pulling and pushing Olivia's limp weight. Max guided them tirelessly, his broad shoulders straining as he tugged at the officer's coat, his breath steaming like smoke in the cold. Through the trees, Emily saw a plain of vac, faint yellow glow. Her heart leapt. A house, not far, just across the ridge, where the road curved. "Look, Max," she whispered hoarsely, pointing with her mitten. "There's light," Max barked. Once, his deep voice swallowed by the wind, then pressed forward with renewed determination. Emily clung tighter to Olivia's arm, dragging her as best as her small body allowed. Every step was agony, but the glow ahead grew brighter. At last they stumbled into a clearing. There, tucked beneath tall pines, stood a weathered log cabin. Smoke curled faintly from its stone chimney, and warm, the lamplight spilled through frosted windows. The snowdrifts piled high against the porch rails, but to Emily, it looked like a beacon, a piece of heaven in a storm. She staggered to the door, Max nudging Olivia's weight beside her. Emily balled her frozen fists and pounded with all her might. For a moment, nothing stirred inside. Then came the sound of shuffling steps, the creak of old floorboards, and the rattle of a lock. The door opened with a groan, and warm air rushed out to meet them. An elderly woman stood framed in the light. Martha Collins was in her late 60s, short and round, with a kindly face softened by age. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her skin, though lined, glowed with the warmth of someone who had lived a life old of caring. She wore a thick knitted cardigan over a floral dress, slippers on her feet despite the storm outside. Her blue eyes widened in alarm as she took in the scene. A child, a dog, and an unconscious police officer. "Oh, sweet heavens," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "George, come quick." From deeper inside, a man's voice rumbled. "What is it, Martha?" Moments later, George Collins appeared, taller than his wife. George was broad-shouldered, though stooped with age, his frame still showing the mater, remnants of the lumberjack he had once been. His weather-beaten face bore a white beard trimmed short, his skin tanned and creased from decades of outdoor work. A faded flannel shirt hung over suspenders that held up worn corduroy trousers. His gray eyes were sharp, steady, the kind that belonged to a man who had seen hardship and survived. Good Lord," George muttered, striding forward. He knelt beside Olivia, his big hand surprisingly gentle, as he checked her pulse. "She's alive, but weak. Bring them in, Martha." Without hesitation, the couple ushered Emily, Max, and Olivia into the cabin. Warmth enveloped them instantly, the smell of pine logs burning in the stone fireplace, the faint aroma of chicken soup simmering in a pot on the stove. Emily nearly collapsed with relief. George lifted Olivia effortlessly, his old muscles straining but steady. He carried her to the couch near the fire, laying her carefully on the cushions. Max trotted close, his tail low but wagging slightly, never letting Olivia out of his sight. Martha hurried to fetch towels, blankets, and a small first aid kit. She returned with practiced hands, her years as a mother, and grandmother guiding her movements. She dabbed at Olivia's wound with warm cloths, muttering softly, "There, you're safe. Just stay with us." Emily stood near the fire, her coat dripping melted snow onto the rug. Her cheeks burned as warmth seeped back into her body, but her eyes never left Olivia. "Tell me what happened, child," Martha said gently as she worked. "How did you come to be out in this storm?" Emily swallowed hard. Her voice was small, uncertain, but the words tumbled out. "Her car, it crashed. Max, he found me and brought me there. We pulled her out. She wasn't waking up. So, we came here." Martha paused, her kind eyes softening. She brushed Emily's damp braid back from her shoulder. "You did a brave thing, sweetheart. Not many girls your age could have managed that." George grunted in agreement, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Saved her life, most likely." He glanced at Max, who sat protectively beside Olivia, ears flicking with every sound, and the dog-smart one he island Emily knelt beside Max, resting her small hand against his fur. He leaned into her touch, his amber eyes fixed on Olivia's pale face. Minutes passed in quiet urgency. Martha wrapped Olivia in blankets, tucked a pillow under her head, and placed a damp cloth on her forehead. The officer stirred. Faintly, her lips parting, a horse breath escaping. Emily leaned closer, heart pounding. "She's waking up." Olivia's eyelids fluttered, her hazel eyes glazed and unfocused. She moaned, softly, shifting against the cushions. George steadied her shoulders while Martha whispered encouragement. Finally, Olivia's eyes opened halfway, fixing on Emily and then Max. Recognition, flickered pain, confusion, and something else. She licked her cracked lips, her voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered. "Someone wanted me dead." The room fell into silence. Emily's heart dropped, her breath catching in her throat. She stared wide-eyed at the injured officer, the weight of the words pressing down on her small frame. She realized with chilling clarity that she had stepped into something far bigger and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The cabin was quiet, except for the steady crackle of the fire and the storm howling against the windows. Olivia Hayes lay wrapped in blankets on the couch, her breathing uneven but stronger than before. The warmth of the Collins home had pulled her back from the edge, but her face remained pale, her eyes shadowed with pain and exhaustion. Emily sat on the rug near Max, her small fingers tangled in the dog's thick fur. Max leaned against her, his amber eyes fixed on Olivia, ears flicking at every sound. He looked as though he were waiting, watching for her to speak. Martha Collins, still in her knitted cardigan, hovered beside the couch with a damp cloth, dabbing gently at Olivia's temple. The older woman's blue eyes were filled with both concern and curiosity, though her voice was steady when she spoke. "Child, you've been through something terrible. You don't have to talk tonight. Rest. We'll call the doctor first thing in the morning." But Olivia shook her head faintly. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "No, you don't understand. There isn't time." George Collins, standing at the hearth, turned sharply. He had been a man of action in his younger years. Once a logger, once strong enough to fell entire trees alone, now stooped in his 70 his broad shoulders still carried that air of solidity. His gray eyes narrowed as he looked at Olivia. "What do you mean there isn't time?" His voice was rough, like gravel dragged across wood. Olivia swallowed, her gaze flickering between them. She glanced at Emily, then at Max, as if weighing whether she should. "Speak." Max wed softly, his nose brushing her hand on the blanket. Something in that touch steadied her. I was investigating," Olivia said finally, her voice arse, but growing firmer with each word. "A network, not just petty. Crimes, something bigger. Drugs, corruption. It leads back to the very people sworn to protect this town." Martha's hand froze midair. George's jaw tightened, his white beard bristling. Olivia drew a ragged breath. "The sheriff, Sheriff Dalton. He's not the man everyone thinks he island. He's been protecting traffickers, taking bribes, silencing officers who ask questions. I found records. Evidence too much for him to ignore. He must have realized I was close." She shut her eyes briefly. "That truck tonight, it wasn't an accident. It was meant to finish me." The words hung in the room like smoke. Emily hugged Max tighter, her blue eyes wide with fear. "The sheriff. But everyone likes him. He waved at me last week when I walked with Grandma." Olivia opened her eyes, meeting Emily's gaze with grim seriousness. "That's what makes him dangerous. He hides behind charm and trust, but underneath, he's ruthless." George crossed the room slowly, the weight of Olivia's revelation heavy in his steps. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his weathered hands clasped tightly. "I worked with Dalton's father back at the mill," George said, his voice dark. "Good man. Hard work. I always wondered how his son turned so slick. Money changes men, makes them think they're untouchable." He rubbed a hand over his beard, troubled. "But this? Drugs, corruption. In Evergreen," Martha pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And if he wanted you dead?" She glanced toward the window where the storm beat against the glass, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then he won't stop looking for you." Olivia nodded faintly. "Which means you're all in. Danger now. By sheltering me, you've become targets too." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The weight of her words settled over the cabin, making the storm outside seem less threatening than the enemy that stalked them. Max shifted suddenly, ears prick-ricked, muscles tense. He growled, low, eyes flashing toward the door. Emily gasped, clutching his fur. But after a moment, the growl faded, just the wind rattling the shutters. Still, Olivia reached for him, her hand trembling as it rested on his neck. "He knows," she whispered. "He remembers." George frowned. "What do you mean?" Olivia's gaze softened, grief flickering across her features. "Max wasn't always mine. He served with another officer before me, a man named Trevor Kane. Trevor uncovered something about Dalton 2 years ago. He didn't live to tell it. Max was there that night. He saw. He felt it. And ever since, he's known her eyes mist. That's why he reacts whenever Dalton is near. He remembers the danger." Max wed again, pressing his head against Olivia's chest. Emily looked between them, her young mind trying to grasp the depth of what she was hearing. "So Max He knew it was. Them who hurt you? Olivia nodded. Yes, and he knew he couldn't save me alone. That's why he found you. She reached out a weak hand, brushing Emily's shoulder. You were his only chance to bring me back. Emily's throat tightened, and she blinked back tears. She was only 9. But in that moment, she felt the enormity of what she had done and what she was now part of. George rose to his feet, pacing near the fire. We need to be smart, he muttered, his voice rough, with determination. If Dalton's men are out there, we can't just call the local station. They'll be listening, he turned to Olivia. What do you need from us? Olivia inhaled slowly, forcing strength into her battered body. I need time to heal enough to move to get this evidence into the right hands, federal hands. Until then, you can't tell anyone I'm here. Martha pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Her heart was soft, but she was not naive. She had lived through the Vietnam years, protests, scandals that rocked small towns. She knew corruption wasn't just a story for big cities. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Then you'll stay here until you can move. We'll keep you safe. George gave a sharp nod, his gray eyes firm. We've weathered storms before. We'll weather this one. Emily looked from the Collins to Olivia, her young chest tightening with both pride and fear. She understood now. This wasn't just about saving a woman from a car crash. This was about protecting a secret that could shatter her entire town. Max settled at Olivia's side, his body curled protectively against her. His tail thumped once against the floor, then stilled. His amber eyes remained fixed on the door, as though daring danger to try again. The fire crackled louder, shadows dancing along the log walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a deeper storm had taken root. The storm of truth, of danger, and of the battle yet to come. Morning came slowly, the storm finally breaking after a night that seemed endless. Snow blanketed the Pines Inn. Heavy silence, and the world outside the Collins cabin looked as though it had been remade in white. But inside, tension lingered like smoke, even as the fire burned low. Olivia Hayes sat, propped against pillows on the couch, wrapped in Martha's knitted quilt. Though her skin was still pale, the strength in her hazel eyes had returned. Beside her, Max lay curled on the rug, his head resting on his paws, amber eyes flicking up every time the wind rattled the shutters. Emily sat close to him, fingers buried in his thick fur, as if drawing courage from his steady warmth. George paced near the window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Martha poured strong coffee into chipped mugs, her soft face creased with worry. They had lived long enough to know that secrets like the one Olivia carried had a way of burning down everything around them. And yet, help arrived. The knock at the door was firm, precise, the kind of knock that carried authority. George stiffened, exchanging a weary glance with Olivia. Stay put, he muttered, striding to the door. He opened it cautiously. 2 figures stood on the porch, their dark coats dusted with snow. The first was a tall man in his 42s with a square jaw, a neatly trimmed beard and eyes as sharp as winter ice. His dark hair, peppered with gray at the temples, was slicked back, and his posture spoke of discipline honed over decades. He introduced himself with a badge, Special Agent Daniel Reeves, FBI. His voice was low, steady, the kind that could cut through chaos without rising. Reeves had built his career dismantling corrupt networks across rural America. His mistrust of small-town politics born from his own youth in a farming family where a crooked sheriff had once nearly destroyed his community. Beside him stood his partner, Special Agent Sarah Mitchell. She was in her mid-32s, tall and lean with straight black hair pulled into a ponytail. Her skin was olive-toned, her dark eyes keen and unyielding. Sarah carried herself like the woman who had fought hard for her place, her movements precise and efficient. A thin scar traced her jawline, a reminder from an undercover operation years ago where she'd nearly lost her life. She didn't smile easily, but her compassion showed in the way she softened her tone when speaking to civilians. George studied them for a long moment before stepping aside. Come in, but if you're not who you say you are, this house won't be your safe haven. Reeves gave a short nod, respecting the old man's caution. Fair enough. Inside, Sarah's gaze immediately landed on Olivia. Recognition flashed across her features. Officer Hayes, she said gently, crossing the room. We've been looking for you. We intercepted chatter last night. Your name came up. We feared the worst. Olivia's lips curved into the faintest smile. You almost did, if it weren't for them. She gestured toward Emily and Max. Emily flushed, ducking her head, while Max thumped his tail once against the rug. Sarah crouched beside the girl, her scar softening into something almost tender. "You must be Emily." Emily looked up timidly, blue, eyes wide. "I just helped. Max did most of it." Reeves's gaze flicked to the German shepherd, his stern features eased slightly. "That dog's seen more than most men." The conversation turned grave as Olivia recounted what she had uncovered. She spoke of records hidden in locked drawers at the sheriff's office, of suspicious shipments routed through Evergreen, of meetings late at night with known traffickers. Her voice was steady, though her hand trembled slightly against the quilt. "Dalton has been at the center of it. He protects them. I've gathered evidence, but it's incomplete. They tried to kill me before. I could turn it over." Reeves leaned forward, his sharp eyes burning. "Do you still have it?" Olivia nodded toward her bag, which Emily had carried from the wreck. Inside, Reeves and Sarah found a battered folder sealed in plastic. Bank, records, surveillance photos, coded notes, enough to open doors in court. Sarah's voice trembled as she snapped the folder shut. "This isn't just corruption," she whispered. "It's a web. Dalton's only a piece of something much larger." George sank deeper into his armchair, exhaling a long, defeated breath. "Our own sheriff. Never thought I'd see it." Martha's hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale, her eyes brimming with tears. "All those years we trusted him, all those Sundays he shook our hands." Reeves leaned forward, gaze hard on Olivia. "Your testimony, this evidence, it can burn the whole network down, but it paints a target on your back, on all of us." Olivia's jaw set like iron. "Then we don't wait, we strike first." Just then, Max stiffened, hackles bristling, his amber eyes fixed on the window, ears sharp as blades. Emily felt her pulse thunder. For a heartbeat, the room froze. The storm rattled the glass, snow tumbling against the panes. Max growled low, then slowly lowered himself, eyes still wary. It wasn't the storm, it was a warning. Hours later, Olivia was whisked away under Reeves and Sarah's protection. What followed shook Evergreen to its core. FBI raids swept through warehouses. Deputies were led away in cuffs, and Sheriff Dalton, once the smiling face of trust, was dragged before flashing cameras, his charm stripped away, rage twisting his face. The town staggered under the weight of betrayal, and yet, amid the rubble, a name rose: Emily Parker. Reporters called her the girl who followed a bark in the blizzard. Her classmates stared in awe. The mayor named her a local hero. But Emily shook her head. She knew the truth. Without Max, she never would have found Olivia, never would have dared face the storm. Weeks later, inside the Collins cabin, the fire glowed warm. Olivia, stronger now, her auburn hair brushed neatly, sat with her hazel eyes lit by determination. Max sprawled at her feet, his tail sweeping in quiet contentment. Emily sat beside him, sketching his proud silhouette into her notebook. "You saved me," Olivia said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. "Not just from the crash, from giving up. You reminded me why we fight." Emily blushed, her pencil pausing. Max barked once loud, sure, final, as if sealing the truth into the walls of that cabin. But before the Collinses could smile, headlights flared across the frosted window. A car. Too late for neighbors, too quiet for friends. The room held its breath. Olivia's hand slid to the pistol at her hip. Max rose, every muscle coiled. Emily's sketchbook slipped from her lap. The battle wasn't over. The storm outside Evergreen might have passed, but another was waiting at their door. And that night, as firelight danced on their faces, it became clear. Miracles don't always end a story. Sometimes they begin the next fight for truth.